There is an image you might carry without knowing it. An immense continent, green and silent. Infinite forests that no one has ever touched. Plains roamed by herds of bison that no one has ever counted. Jagged coastlines where the wind blows over sand that no one has ever walked upon. A virgin world, a new world, a world that was waiting. It is the image that generations of school children have received in the United States. In Canada, across the Americas, everywhere the history of the discovery of the new world has been taught. It is this image that traveled with it. Columbus arrives, the world opens, history begins. But this image is false. Not approximately false, not slightly inaccurate. Radically, profoundly, fundamentally false in almost every single one of its details. What Christopher Columbus saw from the deck of the Santa Maria on October 12, 1492, was not an empty world. It was the periphery of a world inhabited by tens of millions of people, a world of cities and roads, of governments and constitutions, of gardens and engineering, of languages, oral literatures, mathematics, and astronomy. A world just as complex, just as alive, just as human as any civilization of the old world at that exact same time. And tonight, that is the world we are going to talk about. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a second. Whether you are listening from New York, California, Texas, the Midwest, or anywhere else across the country or the world, I am genuinely curious to know where you are listening from tonight. Write it down in the comments. It touches me every time to see the geography of these voices gathered in the dark. And before we continue, a real question for you. Do you have an image in your head of the Americas before Columbus? An idea of what it looked like, of how many people lived here? If you had to bet, what would you say? 1 million? 10 million? More? Note your answer mentally. We will come back to it. And if these stories interest you, if the idea of spending your night discovering what you were never taught appeals to you, go ahead and subscribe. There are others waiting for you. Let us return to it, because the sheer scale of what we are going to explore tonight deserves that we lay the foundations with care. The idea that pre-Columbian America was a virgin and sparsely populated territory was not born out of a mistake. It was born out of a necessity. To justify colonization, the taking of land, the destruction of cultures, the displacement or extermination of populations, it was politically and morally convenient to decide that these lands belonged to no one. That no one literally really lived there. Or at least, that no one who counted lived there. European philosophers of the 18th century, people like Rousseau, with the best of intentions, invented the noble savage, a pure, innocent human being, close to nature but fundamentally simple. Fundamentally without history. Fundamentally without a future of their own. It is this image that crossed the centuries and arrived in school textbooks, complete with the feathers, the tomahawk and the teepee on the prairie. What archaeology, genetics, and the history of the last 50 years have revealed is of an entirely different magnitude. Imagine a crossing, not physical but mental, a slow flight over this continent. In the year 1200 of our era, you are somewhere above what will one day be called the Mississippi River. It is cold. It is autumn, and the forests of the Midwest are beginning to turn orange and red. Below you, on the banks of the river, there is a city, a real city. Streets, public squares, markets, houses made of wood and wattle, arranged in neighborhoods, granaries full of corn, a wooden palisade surrounding the ceremonial center, and in the middle of it all, a structure so massive, it crushes everything around it. An earthen mound, built by hand, whose base is wider than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This city is Cahokia. It holds between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants. At that exact same time, London has barely that many. Paris, a little more. Rome is still rebuilding after centuries of decline. Cahokia is at this moment one of the largest cities in the Western world, and you had probably never heard of it before tonight. Continue your flight toward the southwest. You pass over the high desert plateaus of New Mexico. There, in an isolated canyon, sits a city of a different kind. A city of stone built right into the rock faces of a cliff. Pueblo Bonito. 4 stories high, several hundred rooms, and around it, a network of perfectly straight roads, traced without a compass or any known measuring instrument, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. Some of these roads align with the setting sun on the winter solstice. Some lead to ceremonial sites that the human eye from the ground cannot even distinguish. Continue south, Mexico and the pyramids of Teotihuacan, a city that held up to 200,000 inhabitants at its peak in the 5th century of our era. The Aztecs, who rediscovered it 500 years after it was abandoned, did not know who had built it. They gave it a name that means the place where men become gods. Keep going, the Amazon. This time, seen from above, it is an endless carpet of green. But if you could get closer to the ground, you would see something extraordinary. Certain areas of the forest have a black subsoil. Not orange, like the natural tropical laterite soil, black, rich, and alive. This black earth is a human creation. An agricultural technology developed over generations to feed millions of people in an environment that nature alone would not permit. Go even further south, the Andes. There lies an empire, the Inca Empire, which at its peak in the 15th century was perhaps the largest empire in the world by population. Between 6 and 12 million direct inhabitants, connected by nearly 20,000 miles of paved roads. Roads that cross deserts, tropical forests and glaciers at altitudes of 16,000 feet, 20,000 miles. To give you a sense of scale, that is more than the entire road network of the Roman Empire at its peak. This Inca network had neither wagons nor horses. It was traveled on foot by runners, the chasqui, who relayed each other every 2 hours and could transmit a message from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles in less than a week. That is what this continent was in 1492, not a human desert, not an empty space waiting for civilization, a full world, an ancient world, a world that had the time, over 15 to 23,000 years of human persistence, to develop solutions to almost every problem posed by life in a complex environment. Perhaps the most persistent misconception about the indigenous peoples of the Americas is this one, that they lived in a simple, passive relationship with their environment, that they followed nature without really transforming it, that they had no real history of their own, or at least no history comparable to that of the great civilizations of the Old World. The evidence accumulated over recent decades contradicts this idea on every single point. The indigenous peoples of the Americas did not just follow nature, they manufactured it. The Amazon itself was not an untouched primary forest. It was a garden covering millions of square miles, where the composition of plant species had been carefully guided over millennia to maximize the availability of useful foods and medicines. The forests that seem wild to us are, to a large extent, the result of ancient human choices. William Denevan, the American geographer who made the first rigorous estimate of the pre-Columbian population of the Americas in the 1970s, used a phrase that made history. He called the Amazon, post-1492, an orphan forest, a forest whose gardeners had left, whose human decisions had shaped its composition for millennia, and whose sudden demographic collapse following European contact had abruptly removed the guiding hand. What the first Europeans believed to be a wild and virgin nature was in reality a forest in mourning. Think about what that implies. Imagine a city of 20,000 inhabitants vanishing, its streets emptying, its markets closing, its children ceasing to be born. Slowly, the forest reclaims its rights over the houses, the paths, the fields. In a few generations, the city is nothing more than a mound of earth under the trees. Human traces fade beneath the vegetation. Now multiply that by thousands, by tens of thousands. That is what happened in the Americas between 1492 and 1650. In the span of 1 or 2 generations, between 90 and 95% of the indigenous population disappeared. Not primarily because of wars of conquest, although those were brutal, primarily because of diseases. Smallpox, measles, the flu, typhus. Diseases that Europeans carried without knowing it, and against which the peoples of the Americas had absolutely no immunity, no acquired resistance. We will talk about this collapse in detail in a future chapter, because understanding its nature and its scale is essential to understanding everything else. For now, simply remember this. When the first English, French, and Dutch settlers arrived on the east coast of North America, in the 17th century, they found virgin forests, deserted beaches, and valleys without a single village. They concluded that this continent had always been this way, that it was naturally empty. But this nature was not natural. It was the result of a catastrophe so massive, so rapid, and so total that it had erased even the traces of its own existence. The American historian Francis Jennings wrote in the 1970s that the settlers had not found a wilderness but a widowed land, a land whose husband had just died, a land in mourning. Tonight, we are going to try to recover what existed before that mourning, city by city, invention by invention, person by person. Not to idealize a past that we cannot entirely reconstruct, not to build one myth to replace another, but to understand, as precisely as the evidence allows, what this continent truly was, and to understand, perhaps above all, why we were never taught this. What we are going to discover together over the next few hours does not look like what most people think they know about Native Americans. Not the romantic image from the movies, nor the degrading image from old school books, nor even the revised, often simplified version that is beginning to be taught today. The reality is more complex, more surprising, and I think, more profoundly human than any of these narratives. So, start to settle in, let your shoulders drop. The night is long, and there is much to tell. Because this continent, long before anyone supposedly discovered it, already had 15,000 years of history. And that history, we have barely begun to unearth. It is there, in the dirt, in the knots of forgotten chords, in the black soils of the Amazon, in the words of a language that children are learning to speak again. It is waiting for us. Between the forest in mourning and the city that no one was trying to find, there is a distance of a few hundred miles as the crow flies from the banks of the Mississippi, and almost 1,000 years of silence. Chapter 2. Cahokia, the forgotten city on the Mississippi, that black earth under the trees, that forest that had lost its inhabitants, its roads, its markets, once had a name. It had neighborhoods, ceremonial seasons, teams of people carrying earth in baskets, row after row under an autumn sun. It had bakers and potters, children playing in the streets between the houses, elders watching the sky. It had everything a city possesses, except a name in our history books. Most people who live today in St. Louis, Missouri, cross one of the busiest highway intersections in the United States every single day. Just across the Mississippi River, in Illinois, there is a park. A real park with trees, walking paths, picnic areas, and in this park something strange, hills. Dozens of hills too regular to be natural, too numerous to be accidental. They are mounds. Mounds built by hand. The largest of them, known today as Monk's Mound, has a base spanning over 1,600 feet by 1,000 feet. Its height reaches 100 feet. To build this structure, the inhabitants of Cahokia moved by hand, in baskets carried on human shoulders, without wheels, without beasts of burden, without a single mechanical tool, millions of cubic feet of earth, by hand, basket by basket. The base of this great mound is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurement. You might be wondering why you have never heard of it. It is a good question, and the answer is uncomfortable. The conventional wisdom about the indigenous peoples of North America, Native Americans, First Nations, is that before the arrival of Europeans, they were nomadic hunter-gatherers, organized in small tribal groups, without permanent architecture, without structured government, without cities. Cahokia contradicts this idea with an almost embarrassing brutality. At its peak, around the year 1100 of our era, Cahokia housed between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants within its immediate perimeter, and perhaps 40,000 if you count the farmers living in the surrounding areas. It covered several square miles. It was surrounded by a wooden palisade over 2 miles long. It had markets, residential neighborhoods, ceremonial zones, and a central public space we now call the Grand Plaza, as large as 40 football fields placed side by side. In the year 1100, London had about 18,000 inhabitants. Cahokia was at least in the same order of magnitude. Imagine you are there, in the early 11th century. You arrive at Cahokia from the south, along the banks of the Mississippi. It is hot, it is the middle of summer, and the air smells of river mud and cooking fires. Around you, on the river and its secondary channels, canoes are coming and going. Men are unloading goods. Copper from the Great Lakes, over 600 miles to the north. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, nearly 1,000 miles to the south. Black obsidian, sharp as glass, from the Rocky Mountains. Cahokia is at the center of a trade network that spans a continent. Entering the city, you pass rows of rectangular houses built of wood and wattle, their walls coated with white clay. Women are pounding corn in front of their doors, children running between the posts. The smell of roasted flatbread mixes with the scent of recent rain on warm earth. And then you arrive at the Grand Plaza, and you look up. The great mound is right there in front of you, 100 feet high. Its surface is covered with carefully maintained grass. At the summit, a building, a wooden structure, probably a palace or a temple, dominates the surrounding plain for miles. Wooden stairs climb the flanks of the mound. Guards stand in the heights, motionless under the sun. It is a capital, a true capital. The archaeologists who began excavating Cahokia seriously in the 1960s were baffled by what they found. Not because the evidence was ambiguous. It was, on the contrary, remarkably clear, but because it did not fit the model they had been taught. One of these archaeologists, Warren Whittrey from the Field Museum in Chicago, made an extraordinary discovery in the 1960s while clearing the archaeological layers near the Great Mound. Holes. Dozens of holes dug at regular intervals, arranged in concentric arcs. Holes in which large wooden posts had been planted. He realized that these posts, when standing, formed a circle aligned with precise points of the sunrise and sunset at the equinoxes and solstices. An astronomical observatory, an instrument for measuring time built on the scale of an entire city. He called it, with a sense of showmanship we can forgive, Woodhenge. A wooden Stonehenge on the banks of the Mississippi. 1,000 years after our era, the people of Cahokia were measuring the sky. They aligned their city with the movements of the sun. They celebrated the solstices in ceremonial spaces, designed for that very purpose over generations. This is not the behavior of people without culture or organization. It is the behavior of people who think in the very long term. But Cahokia also leaves us with a question that archaeologists cannot yet resolve. Around 1350 the city was abandoned. Not gradually, quite rapidly. Excavations show a marked decline over the span of just a few generations. The houses ceased to be maintained. The Grand Plaza became overgrown with grass, the palisade was no longer replaced, and then silence. Why? Theories abound. A long drought that might have exhausted the region's agricultural resources. Catastrophic floods that destroyed the crops. An internal political collapse, a revolution, a schism between factions, a rupture between the elites and the population. Perhaps even an organized migration, a collective departure to other regions. Here is what is truly fascinating. No contemporary indigenous people clearly claim direct descent from Cahokia. Some researchers believe that the descendants of the Cahokians scattered among dozens of different peoples, the Osage, the Quapaw, the Ponca, perhaps. But the direct link is broken in living memory. One of the greatest cities of the medieval Western world disappeared without leaving witnesses. Conscious of their own heritage, there is something dizzying about that idea. It must be noted, and this is no minor detail, that the very name Cahokia does not come from the city's inhabitants. It comes from a much later group, the Cahokia, a subdivision of the Illiniwek who lived in the region when the French arrived in the 17th century. The real name of the city, the one its inhabitants used, is lost. We do not know what these people called themselves. We do not know the name of their god, nor the words of their prayers. We do not know what the great mound represented to them, nor what stories they told about its construction. What we do know is that they built it, and that it took them generations. An interesting debate divides researchers today regarding Cahokia. On one side, those who believe the city was governed by a powerful theocratic elite, a god-king or a deified chief, modeled after Mesoamerican civilizations. On the other side, those who believe Cahokia was a more decentralized city-state, a city of pilgrimage and commerce rather than an empire. This debate is not trivial. It fundamentally changes our understanding of Native American politics in North America. Was it a monarchy, a theocracy, a network of clans? The archaeological evidence allows for both readings. What is certain is that something immense and organized was built here, and it lasted 300 years. 300 years. Let's put that into perspective. Exactly 300 years ago, America was not yet a country. Mozart had not been born. The American Revolution had not yet happened, and 300 years is not an anecdote. It is a civilization. When Cahokia was founded, the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe did not yet exist. Notre Dame de Paris only began construction in 1163. When Cahokia was abandoned, the 100 Years' War had just begun in Europe. During all that time, during the building of the great cathedrals, during the Crusades, while medieval Europe was tearing itself apart and rebuilding, Cahokia lived, grew, worked, and watched the sun rise over its wooden observatory. Today, the site of Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There is an interpretive center, informational plaques, a parking lot. Most people who live in St. Louis have never been there. And in most American history textbooks, Cahokia is mentioned, if it is mentioned at all, in just a few lines, a curiosity, an archaeological mystery. Not a city, not a civilization, not something that forces us to entirely rethink the image we have of pre-Columbian North America. There is an American researcher, Timothy Pacatat, from the University of Illinois, who has dedicated much of his career to Cahokia. In one of his books, he asks the question directly, if a city of this size had existed in Europe at the same time, and if we had the same archaeological evidence for it, would we have ignored it in the same way? The obvious, disconcerting answer is no. Tonight, you are lying in the dark. Maybe it is raining outside, or maybe it is just night and silent. And somewhere, just a few miles from St. Louis, there is a field with mounds in the darkness. The exact same mounds as in the year 1100, slightly eroded by 9 centuries of rain, covered with grass and trees, but they're still there. They have not moved. That is perhaps the simplest and most powerful thing one can say about Cahokia, that it is still there, that the earth moved by hand, basket by basket, over generations, has not returned to its original state. It stayed in place. It waits. It has waited for us to give it back its history. Let that image settle. The great mound in the night, 100 feet high, silent. A city whose name we have lost. The soil that hands shaped over generations to build a city. Those same hands in other regions of the continent were shaping something even more durable. Not piled earth, but transformed earth, to feed millions of the living for centuries after their deaths. Chapter 3. The Black Forest of the Amazon. The earth of Cahokia's great mound is displaced earth lifted, carried, piled. An earth that says, we were here. But thousands of miles to the south, there is another earth shaped by human hands. An earth that does not just say, we were here. It says something stranger, gentler, longer. It says, we thought of you. In the lower Amazon basin, in the state of Pará in Brazil, There are farmers who know something that science took decades to understand. Certain patches of their land are different, not slightly different, radically different. The normal soil of the region is reddish-orange, lateritic, poor in nutrients. It is the typical soil of humid tropical regions. The intense rain washes it away, and what is left is difficult, capricious earth that depletes quickly if cultivated. But in certain areas that seem to appear without apparent logic, like dark stains in a light-colored field, the soil is black. Deeply, intensely black, rich, fragrant, and local farmers have known this for generations. In these black zones, plants grow better, the earth is better, and curiously, the more you cultivate it, the more you work it, the more it seems to regenerate on its own. They call it Terra Preta, the dark earth. In the 1960s, a Brazilian geologist named Wim Sombroek, following early observations by others, began to study these zones of unusually fertile soil along the banks of the Amazon. What was found was baffling. Beneath the surface of the Terra Preta, there were shards of pottery, bones, charcoal. Layers upon layers of carbonized organic matter mixed into the earth to depths of up to 6 feet. This soil was not natural, it had been manufactured. These early discoveries sparked little interest at first. The idea that pre-colonial Amazonian peoples could have deliberately modified their soil to such depths did not fit the dominant model. The model of a sparsely populated Amazon inhabited by nomadic groups practicing rudimentary / burn agriculture. It wasn't until the 1980s, and especially the 90s, that researchers returned to studying Terra Preta with modern tools. What they found fundamentally changed our understanding of the pre-Columbian Amazon. Here is what Terra Preta actually is: charcoal, but not just any charcoal. Charcoal produced by a slow, low-temperature combustion that preserves the porous structure of the wood. This type of charcoal, which we now call biochar, has an extraordinary property. It creates a microscopic architecture in the soil, millions of tiny cavities that retain water, nutrients, and above all, beneficial microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, worms, the invisible architects of fertility. Add to that calcined bones, snail and mollusk shells, kitchen waste, organic matter of all kinds accumulated and integrated over generations, and time, a lot of time. Terra Preta is not something created in a year, or in 10. It is something built over generations. A soil that parents begin to enrich and children finish. Or rather, that no one ever really finishes, because once it is rich enough, it regenerates itself. It continues to improve, even without human intervention. Researchers studying it today have verified this. The Amazonian Terra Preta we analyze was created between 500 and 2,500 years ago, and it is still fertile today. It produces crops that ordinary tropical soil simply cannot produce. The work of those hands that pounded charcoal, burned bones, buried shells, and mixed it all with patience. That work is still there, still active, still nourishing. You might think this sounds like gardening. Something local, modest, artisanal. It is not. The most recent estimates, notably from work published in 2023 by MIT researchers, suggest that Terra Preta covered, at its peak, between 3 and 10% of the total surface of the Amazon. That represents hundreds of thousands of square miles of intentionally transformed soil. To give you a sense of scale, that is roughly the size of Texas and California combined. All of it enriched, worked, cared for inch by inch, generation after generation. And these soils fed populations we are only just beginning to measure. Archaeologists working in the Amazon today, using technologies like LiDAR that can see beneath the vegetation from a plane, regularly discover massive settlement sites that no one suspected. Villages of several thousand inhabitants, networks of roads, geometric structures of a precision that suggests large-scale planning. Anna Roosevelt, an archaeologist at the Field Museum in Chicago, spent much of the 1980s and 90s excavating the Pedra Pintada cave in Brazil and surrounding sites. What she found: evidence of human occupation going back over 11,000 years with a sophisticated material culture, traces of agriculture, cave paintings, caused a real scandal in the archaeological community of the time. The scandal was not that the evidence was insufficient. The scandal was that it was good, and that it overturned the dominant model. Here is the thing most people don't know about the Amazon. What we call the primary tropical rainforest, this supposedly untouched, immemorially wild forest, is to a very large extent a secondary forest, a forest of regrowth, a forest that grew back after the death of its inhabitants. Botanists studying the composition of plant species in the Amazon notice something strange. Species useful for human food, Brazil nut palms, gourds, dozens of varieties of fruit trees, are overrepresented in the Amazonian forest, compared to what natural, random distribution would predict. These species are not distributed randomly in the forest. They form concentrations, clusters that often correspond to the zones of Terra Preta. The Amazon forest remembers its gardeners. It bears their imprint in its botanical composition, in its distribution of species, in its concentrations of fertility. 5 centuries after the disappearance of most of its inhabitants, the forest continues to look like a half-wheeled garden, a garden whose owners have left. What is perhaps most striking in the story of Terra Preta is what it says about the collective intelligence and long-term thinking of these peoples. Building a fertile soil does not serve the person who starts it. It serves their children, their grandchildren, strangers who will live on the same land 100 years later. Terra Preta is not a short-term investment. It is an act of generosity toward a future one will never see. It is a way of thinking about time that is profoundly different from how most industrial societies think about the environment today. Terra Preta does not deplete, it regenerates. It is designed to be permanent, to be passed down. There is an almost comical irony, if the situation weren't so serious, in the fact that 21st century researchers, confronted with the crisis of modern agricultural soil fertility and the need to sequester carbon to slow climate change, have rediscovered biochar and are calling it a technology of the future. The technology of the future is 1,000 years old. It is Amazonian, and its inventors never needed an international conference to implement it. There is a debate in Terra Preta research that deserves mentioning. For a long time, some researchers argued that Terra Preta was not truly intentional, that it was the accidental result of an accumulation of domestic waste without any deliberate plan to improve the soil. The other camp, which stands on much firmer ground today, argues that the evidence of intention is clear. The chemical composition of the Terra Preta zones, their structural regularity, the carefully balanced proportions of their components, and above all, the traces of low-temperature fires specifically adapted for biochar production, cannot be explained by a simple dumping of waste. The 2023 MIT study settled this quite clearly in favor of intention. The authors concluded that Amazonians deliberately improved their soil for agriculture while sequestering and storing carbon over millennia. What is not yet resolved is the exact scale. How many people lived in the pre-Columbian Amazon? Estimates vary considerably, from 2 million to 10 million for the Amazon alone. This uncertainty is not a detail. It determines whether we are talking about a sparse network of villages or something resembling a full-fledged civilization. Think about that black earth tonight, about someone who 800 years ago burned wood in a pit, crushed bones and shells, and mixed it all with patience and knowledge accumulated over generations, not for themselves, not for that year, but for someone they would never meet. This person did not know that 5 centuries later, these soils would still be producing crops, did not know that scientists would come to analyze this earth with instruments impossible to imagine, did not know that conferences would be held in Paris and Geneva to discuss their invention. They simply knew that the earth you feed, feeds you in return. It is a thought someone had alone in the Amazon, in the humid heat of an afternoon that left no other memory, and the earth still remembers. Deep in the Amazon, under the roots and the centuries, the earth keeps the trace of hands that thought of the future. Thousands of miles to the northeast, other hands at the same time were building something different, not to feed bodies, but to govern nations. Chapter 4, The Great Law of Peace, those nourishing black earths, those decisions made for generations to come. There was already a form of governance there, a political thought. The conviction that the choices of today bind the living who are not yet born. This same thought, taken further, formulated explicitly, translated into institutions, took a precise shape somewhere between the 14th and 16th centuries in the Great Lakes region, in upstate New York. It changed the world, and no one says it. There is something almost every American high school student learns about American democracy, that it draws inspiration from ancient Rome, from the Enlightenment philosophy of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Locke, that Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson built something new from the most advanced European ideas of their time. This is not false, but it is not complete. What textbooks generally fail to mention is that Benjamin Franklin, an experienced diplomat who had spent years negotiating with the indigenous nations of the region, explicitly cited in his writings on the necessary union of the American colonies the example of a confederation he had himself observed functioning for decades, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, those whom the French called the Iroquois, and in 1987, the United States Senate passed a formal resolution acknowledging the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the American Constitution. Who were the Haudenosaunee? The word means people of the longhouse, a reference to the long wooden structure that was both their traditional dwelling and the central political metaphor of their organization. The Confederacy initially united 5 nations, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, and the Seneca. In the early 18th century, a sixth nation, the Tuscarora, joined them, forming the six nations we know today. These nations lived in the heart of what is today New York State and adjacent regions of Canada. They spoke related languages, shared common cultural practices, and had been locked in conflict with one another for generations. Then, something happened. The Haudenosaunee tradition tells the story this way. There was a time, which historians place between the 14th and 16th centuries, when a man named the Peacemaker appeared. He had a vision, that the 5 warring nations could lay down their arms and live under a common law, a law that would guarantee peace not through the domination of one nation over the others, but through a political structure in which each nation would have an equal voice and equal rights. The Peacemaker had a problem. He had a speech impediment. His vision was clear, but his voice could not carry it. He found a spokesman, a man named Hiawatha, who had himself endured profound personal tragedies, losing his daughters and his wife in the intertribal conflicts. Hiawatha was desperate, in mourning broken, and then he met the Peacemaker. Together these two men, the visionary who could not speak clearly, and the grieving orator who had nothing left to lose, forged something that would last for centuries. The Great Law of Peace. What the Great Law established in its oral form, transmitted across generations by men and women whose responsibility it was to remember, was of remarkable sophistication. A federal council bringing together representatives of the 5 nations. These representatives, the sachems, were designated not by popular election, but by the women of their clan. It was the women, the clan mothers, who had the power to nominate the chiefs, and who had the power to remove them if they did not fulfill their role correctly. A system of multi-level deliberation. Important decisions could not be made by a single nation. They required a consensus among all, not a majority vote, a consensus, which meant the discussion continued until an agreement was found, or until a question was set aside for lack of agreement. A mechanism for conflict resolution. Before declaring war, even against an outside enemy, the council had to deliberate. One nation alone could not commit the entire Confederacy to a conflict without the agreement of the others, and a provision that has no immediate equivalent in the European constitutions of the time, the principle of the 7th generation. According to the Great Law of Peace, every important political decision had to be evaluated by its effects on the 7 generations to come, not on immediate interests, on long-term consequences. Did all this really influence the American Constitution? This is where the debate gets interesting. On one side, there is direct evidence. Benjamin Franklin participated in several intercolonial congresses where the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was present and observed. His Albany Plan of Union of 1754, an early draft for uniting the colonies, shows striking structural similarities with Haudenosaunee organization. Haudenosaunee representatives were invited to Albany, New York, to present their system of governance to colonial delegates. On the other side, some historians argue that the influence was more indirect, a general source of inspiration rather than a precise model, that the Founding Fathers drew primarily from European sources, and that the resemblance to the Confederacy reflects a convergence of solutions to similar political problems rather than conscious copying. This debate is legitimate. What is less legitimate is the complete erasure of this source of inspiration from almost every narrative of the birth of American democracy. Whether the influence was direct or indirect, it was there. It was recognized by the actors themselves, Franklin foremost among them. To omit it is to choose an incomplete version of history. There is something important to say about how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy treated women. In most European societies from the 15th to the 18th century, including the most advanced by the standards of the time, women had no formal role in political governance. They did not vote, did not sit in assemblies, did not designate leaders. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the clan mothers were a constitutional institution. Their power to nominate and remove sachems was guaranteed by the Great Law of Peace itself. Without their agreement, no legitimate chief could sit on the council. This is not an anecdotal detail about a primitive culture. It is an institutionalized system of female checks and balances that had no equivalent in Western democracies until the 20th century. Imagine that council, a great longhouse somewhere in the forests of upstate New York. Outside it is cold. It is early winter, and the snow is beginning to cover the branches. Inside, a central fire. Men sitting in a circle, each representing their nation, their clan, their community. They speak, not in a rushed manner, but with the deliberate slowness of those who know that words bind more than just this season. A woman, the clan mother, listens from an adjacent space. What she says will carry weight in the days that follow. If she disapproves of what is decided here, she can recall the sachem she appointed, replace him. The decision can be overturned. It is her right. It is her role, it is the law. And this law, these men and women carry it in their memory for generations, not written on paper, carried in bodies, transmitted by spoken word, embodied in ceremonial gestures, recalled by wampum belts, where each woven pattern encodes an article of the Constitution. You might be drifting off a bit now, and that is fine. Let this image remain. A woman listening in the warmth of a wooden house with the power to change things. Not tomorrow now, tonight. The great law of peace had given the Haudenosaunee a collective voice, where separate nations would have had contradictory ones. Thousands of miles to the south, one man alone sought to give his people a voice of another nature. Not to govern other nations, but to no longer be governed by the sheer will of others. Chapter 5. Sequoyah and the letters he was told were impossible. That woman who listens with the power to change things. That power came from the spoken word, from a law transmitted by memory, carried in bodies, kept alive in the voice. But the voice has its limits. It does not cross distances. It does not survive the death of the one who carried it. It cannot be sent through the forests without a messenger. One man concluded something that no one else had yet concluded in the entire history of his people. He decided to create letters. His name was Sequoyah. He was also given an English name, George Guess or Gist, but that name didn't really belong to him. His father was perhaps an American trapper or soldier he never knew. His mother was Cherokee, and it was the Cherokee culture that formed him entirely. He was born around 1770, the exact year is uncertain, in a Cherokee village in what is today Tennessee. He received no formal education. He spoke no English, or barely any. He could neither read nor write in any language. What launched him into what would become the most solitary and audacious intellectual project of his generation was a simple scene. Sequoyah was watching American soldiers, perhaps during the War of 1812, in which he fought alongside Americans against the British, reading letters around a campfire. These men held pieces of paper in their hands and read news from home, messages from waiting wives, orders from distant officers. Sequoyah understood something that night. These pieces of paper spoke. They carried the voices of the absent. They crossed distances without bodies. His people did not have that. Their stories, their laws, their genealogies, their treaties, all of it lived in mouths, and mouths die. He began to work, not with books, not with teachers, not with the support of an institution or a government, alone. In his blacksmith shop first, then at home scratching symbols onto pieces of bark, onto slates, onto whatever he could find. His neighbors thought he was crazy. His wife, it is said, burned his early notes, thinking he was practicing witchcraft. His forge fell into ruin, his fields went unplowed. He spent his days inventing something that no one around him understood. He first tried to create a pictogram for every Cherokee word. It didn't work. There were too many words, too many nuances, too many contexts. After years of labor, he realized something fundamental. It wasn't the words that needed to be recorded, but the sounds. The elementary syllables of which words are made. The Cherokee language has a finite number of syllables. He cataloged 86 of them, 86 symbols, one for each syllable. Learn these 86 signs, and you can write any Cherokee word, any sentence, any treaty, any love letter. 12 years of work. 12 years in which no one believed him, in which his reputation suffered, in which he was repeatedly on the verge of giving up. In 1821, Sequoyah asked his people to let him prove that his system worked. He proposed a demonstration before the elders and chiefs of his community. His daughter, Ioka, was there. She had been about 6 years old when he started his work. She grew up with these symbols, saw them on the walls and slates, heard them in the explanations her father gave her. She had learned to read them. She was his first public reader. The elders said something to Ioka, phrases she had not heard before. She wrote them down. Sequoyah, in a separate room, read what she had written. He pronounced the sentences, word for word, perfectly. The silence that followed, they say, lasted a long time. What happened next is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. Within 2 years of the syllabary's presentation, the majority of Cherokee adults knew how to read and write in their own language. The majority of adults. In 2 years. In the history of human literacy, this is extraordinary. In Europe, mass literacy took centuries, driven by the church, printers, mandatory schools, generations of teachers. The Cherokee did it in 2 years, with a system created by one man alone. It worked because Sequoyah's syllabary was logical, remarkably logical. It corresponded exactly to the phonological structure of the Cherokee language. It was easy to learn because it faithfully reflected what the mouth did when speaking. By 1828, the Cherokee founded their first bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in both Cherokee and English, with printing type specially cast for the syllabary. The Cherokee press printed news, legal documents, sermons. A people who could not read in 1820 had their own printing press in 1828. We must ask a direct question here. In the worldview that European colonizers held regarding indigenous peoples, there was a profound conviction that these peoples were incapable of high-level intellectual abstraction. That civilization, in the European sense, was inaccessible to them or unnatural for them. Sequoyah, alone, without help, without formal education, without available models, created something that very few human beings in the entire history of humanity have managed to create: an original writing system. He did not adapt the Latin alphabet. He did not copy an existing system. He invented his own. You can count on one hand the individuals in human history who have done something comparable. The creators of Sumerian cuneiform, the inventors of Egyptian hieroglyphs, the architects of Chinese writing, the builders of the Phoenician syllabary, and Sequoyah, a Cherokee blacksmith from the Appalachians around 1820, alone in his abandoned forge. There is a discussion in historical research about whether Sequoyah had, at some point in his work, access to Latin alphabetical characters. Some of his symbols resemble letters of the Roman alphabet, a P, an R, an upside-down V. Some researchers have suggested that he might have seen books, or printed materials, and used them as visual inspiration for the shapes of his characters, even if he assigned them entirely different sounds. Sequoyah himself acknowledged that he might have seen books, but he was illiterate in English. Those shapes meant nothing to him. He used them as empty visual vessels that he filled with Cherokee meaning. The system he built was original, functional, and entirely adapted to a language that no other existing system could write. Sequoyah spent the final years of his life searching for scattered Cherokee tribes, those who had been removed to the west, those who had fled to Mexico, to teach them his syllabary, to ensure that wherever the Cherokee found themselves, they would have the same letters, the same tool, the same written voice. He died around 1843, probably somewhere in Mexico during one of these expeditions, alone or almost alone, old. The exact circumstances of his death and the location of his grave remain unknown. There is a sequoia, the tallest tree in the world, in the forests of California that bears his name, Sequoia sempervirens, the ever-living sequoia. It was not his wish, but it is a fitting image. Rest your head a little deeper into the pillow. There are Cherokee children today, right now in the state of Oklahoma and in North Carolina, who are learning to read in Sequoiah's syllabary. 3-year-old children in language immersion programs, pronouncing Cherokee syllables that their great-grandparents thought were lost forever. These children do not yet know who Sequoyah was, but their language in their mouths is his work, those signs, those 12 years alone in a forge. Something one man built so his daughter could read, and so great-grandchildren he would never meet could speak. The voice survives. Those Cherokee letters, those shapes invented to give a durable voice to what would otherwise fade, could not prevent what was coming. In the years following the publication of the syllabary, a political catastrophe was brewing, but before that, long before that, and on a scale that letters could not yet measure, another catastrophe had already occurred. The greatest, the most silent, the most unthinkable. Chapter 6, The Invisible Disease. Those letters that Sequoyah invented, those 86 syllables, tailored to give a lasting voice to what would otherwise disappear, could only be born because there was still a people left to receive them. 3 centuries earlier, in other regions of the continent, there was no one left. Empty cities, abandoned fields, paths leading nowhere, not because of a war, not because of an invasion, because of a cold. This is one of the hardest things to wrap the mind around, not because it is complex, but because it is simply too vast. Between 1492 and 1650, the indigenous populations of the Americas lost between 90 and 95% of their people in the span of 1 or 2 generations. Let's take a moment to make that real. The United States today has about 330 million inhabitants. Imagine that in the next 100 years, within the span of a single human lifetime, over 300 million of those people disappear. Only a fraction remains, survivors scattered in half-empty cities, villages without children, decimated families, languages that no longer have enough speakers to be passed down, knowledge that dies with the last elders, cultural practices that extinguish for lack of hands to carry them. That is what happened in the Americas, at that scale, at that speed. And the vast majority of the victims did not die because of direct violence. They died from biological bad luck, from an immune system that had not had the time to learn to recognize diseases that had been absent from this continent for tens of thousands of years. To understand what happened, you need a little biology. Europe, Africa, and Asia have been connected for millennia by trade routes, migrations, invasions. These human exchanges were also exchanges of disease. Smallpox, measles, the flu. These diseases swept through Eurasia for millennia, killing entire populations, then leaving survivors whose children and grandchildren inherited a certain immune resistance. Not total immunity, these diseases continued to kill in Europe too, but a partial resistance acquired over generations of exposure. The Americas, isolated from Eurasia for at least 10,000 years, perhaps longer, had not had this contact. Their inhabitants had never encountered smallpox, never encountered measles, never encountered the flu in its Eurasian forms. Their immune systems had no recognition model for these pathogens. When smallpox arrived, carried involuntarily but inevitably in the bodies of the first Europeans, it met an entirely naive population, without acquired defense, without preformed antibodies. The result was catastrophic beyond anything words can describe. In the Caribbean, populations that numbered perhaps 500,000 to 1 million inhabitants in 1492 had practically vanished by 1550. 60 years. One generation. In Mexico, the region under Aztec domination had between 15 and 25 million inhabitants in 1519. Upon the arrival of Hernán Cortés, a century later, about 1 million remained, a reduction of 90 to 95%. In the Andes, a smallpox epidemic preceded the arrival of Francisco Pizarro. It had already killed the Inca ruler Huayna Capac and his heir before the conquistadors even reached Inca territory. The empire was in a civil war of succession when Pizarro arrived, a civil war caused in part by the disease that had decapitated the leadership. On the east coast of North America, European explorers and traders, Portuguese, English, French, visited the coasts beginning in the early 16th century. They brought with them, unknowingly, their diseases. When the first permanent English settlers established themselves at Plymouth in 1620, they found coastal areas almost deserted. A survivor of the region, Tisquantum, whom the English called Squanto, showed them how to grow corn and survive. He was, at that moment, one of the last members of his people. The Patuxet had been decimated by an epidemic a few years earlier. Tisquantum himself had been taken to Europe by an English navigator and returned to his native region only to find his village empty, his family dead, his people gone. There is a discovery that helps measure the sheer magnitude of what happened, and it comes from an unexpected direction. In 2019, a team of researchers from University College London published a remarkable study in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews. They had analyzed polar ice cores and sedimentary records to measure CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere between the 16th and 17th centuries. They found something strange, a significant drop in atmospheric CO2 between 1550 and 1650, a drop so steep that it contributed to the period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. Why did the CO2 drop? Because the forests and farmlands of the Americas, abandoned by their inhabitants, had grown back. Tens of millions of acres of cultivated land, of gardens, of abandoned fields had been reclaimed by vegetation in the span of a few decades, and that vegetation absorbed enormous quantities of carbon. The death of 50 to 100 million people in the Americas was massive enough to alter the global climate. Repeat that slowly in your head. The disappearance of the indigenous peoples of the Americas was profound enough to cool the planet. Here's what that number means at the level of a family. A mother watching her children die one by one, without understanding what is happening. Sick herself, or perhaps not. Smallpox strikes some and spares others in a way that seems random, cruel in its illogic. She hears the weeping in the neighboring houses. She steps outside and sees neighbors who no longer have the strength to stand. She looks for a healer, but the healer is dead too. She seeks out the elders. The elders are the first to die. They, who had accumulated the most exposure to life, were the most fragile against the novelty of the disease. The elders die first, and they are the ones who carry the knowledge. The histories, the names of medicinal plants, the formulas for ceremonies, the genealogies of clans, the diplomatic relations with neighboring nations. When the elders die too fast, the knowledge dies with them. There is no one left to pass it on, no one to receive what should have been handed down. There is a major historical debate surrounding this catastrophe. On one side, some historians, including Sherburne Cook and Woodrow Bora, who were among the first to document the scale of the losses in the 1960s, insist that while epidemics were the primary mechanism of death, they cannot be separated from the colonial context that accompanied them. The dispossession of farmland, forced labor in mines, the destruction of food networks, direct violence. All of this weakened populations that might have survived an epidemic under normal conditions. On the other side, some researchers argue that the impact of the epidemics would have been catastrophic even without colonial violence, that the simple biological contact, inevitable in any intercontinental exchange, would have triggered a demographic disaster regardless of European behavior. These two positions are not entirely incompatible. The disease would have killed many in any case, but the colonial conditions, the forced labor, the starvation, the violence, turned a catastrophe into near extinction in certain regions. The combination of biology and politics produced something neither would have produced alone. Whether this catastrophe falls under the legal and moral definition of genocide remains a debate that historians, legal scholars, and indigenous communities continue to navigate. What is certain is that the America the first permanent settlers found in the 17th century was not the America that had existed 100 years earlier. The virgin forests the Puritans walked through at Plymouth were recent forests, spaces that had been, within the memory of a single generation, inhabited fields and villages. The Native Americans who survived, and some survived by biological chance, by isolation, by partial resistance, lived in a decimated world. They were mourning not just a person or a family, but everything. A shattered collective memory, collapsed institutions, dissolved networks of alliance, and in that fragility they faced the next wave. Deliberate colonization, wars, displacements, broken treaties, new epidemics. What is remarkable, what we will return to in the final chapters of this night, is that they faced it at all. Let this silence settle. There is something words cannot quite capture in the sheer scale of what we have just described. 50 million, 100 million. These numbers slide off the mind like water over glass, so just stay with this image. A woman alone in an empty house. Outside, the village is silent. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of absence. Her children are no longer there. Her neighbors are no longer there. Smoke no longer rises from the chimneys. Dogs no longer run between the houses. She is still there for now. She looks at the door. Let that be there. That woman in her silent house. What survived her were the refusals, the resistances, the attempts to rebuild something intact in a broken world. And one of those resistances almost changed the course of an entire continent. Chapter 7. Tecumseh, the man who wanted to stop a continent. That woman in the silent house. She had descendants, children who survived, grandchildren who grew up in a radically impoverished world, but who grew up nonetheless. And among those descendants, through the generations, there were men and women who looked at this impoverished world and refused to accept its logic. One of them was perhaps the most brilliant political strategist in North America in the early 19th century. His name was Tecumseh. He was born around 1768, the exact year is uncertain, in a Shawnee village in what is today Ohio. His father was killed in a battle against American settlers when Tecumseh was a child. His brother was born and died in another battle. Another brother yet in a third. Tecumseh grew up in war, not the war as it had existed in the past, ritualized conflicts between indigenous nations to capture prisoners or defend a specific territory, but a war of a new kind, a war of erasure, a war whose objective was not victory but disappearance. He understood something that very few of his contemporaries saw as clearly, that as long as the indigenous nations fought separately, they would systematically lose. That American expansion was not a series of isolated conflicts between specific peoples for specific territories. It was a single continuous movement that would only stop when it met no more resistance. The only adequate response, he believed, was a confederation, a united Indian state, a political entity capable of negotiating as equals with the United States or, if negotiations failed, of opposing them with a coordinated resistance. There is a scene that summarizes Tecumseh's political intelligence better than any analysis. It is August 1810. The governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, future president of the United States, has summoned Tecumseh to Vincennes to discuss recent land cessions. Harrison had met with representatives of several nations who had signed treaties ceding land. Tecumseh considered these treaties void. His position was clear and built on a legal logic that was difficult to refute. The land did not belong to any particular nation. It belonged to all nations together. Therefore, no single nation could sell it without the consent of all the others. He arrived at the meeting with several hundred warriors. A show of force, yes, but also of diplomatic dignity. Harrison offered him a chair to sit and speak. Tecumseh refused to sit. "My chair," he said, "is the earth. The earth is my mother. I will rest only on her bosom." This was not a romantic posture. It was a precise political message. We are not here as subjects received by a governor. We are here as a sovereign nation on our own soil. Tecumseh traveled continuously, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Appalachians to the Great Plains. He met with chiefs of nations who had never had contact with one another. He spoke in dozens of different languages, or through interpreters. He carried the same message everywhere. Only unity can survive what is coming. His speeches, in the translations made by his American and British contemporaries, who had no reason to embellish them, possessed a rhetorical power that impressed even his adversaries. An American officer who heard him speak in 1811 wrote in his report, This man is perhaps the most extraordinary Indian genius that has ever existed. This was not an easy compliment. That officer knew what was at stake. Tecumseh's project was unprecedented in the history of North America. It was not simply about forming a temporary military alliance. It was about building a state, a permanent political entity with shared institutions, capable of defending itself and representing itself in international negotiations. And for this project, he had something even more important than warriors. He had an ideology. His younger brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, had experienced visions. After struggling with alcoholism and marginalization, he had a mystical experience in 1805 that transformed him. He preached a return to traditional practices, the rejection of alcohol and American goods, cultural rebirth. Tecumseh and the Prophet formed a remarkable pair. One built the politics, the other built the identity. One mobilized the warriors, the other mobilized the spirits. Together, they drew thousands of people to their settlement, Prophetstown, on the banks of the Tippecanoe River in present-day Indiana. The American response was swift and brutal. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was traveling through the South, trying to rally more nations, Harrison attacked Prophetstown. The Battle of Tippecanoe was not a crushing victory. The defenders fought hard, and Harrison suffered significant losses. But Prophetstown was destroyed. The Prophet lost his credibility, and Tecumseh's coalition, not yet fully formed, was profoundly shaken. Tecumseh did not give up. He allied with the British during the War of 1812, receiving the rank of Brigadier General, a formal military recognition no Native American had ever received from a European power. He led brilliant campaigns, capturing strategic positions, humiliating American generals. And on October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in what is today southern Ontario, the British Army retreated under an American assault. Tecumseh's allies held the line, then were overwhelmed. Tecumseh continued to fight, almost alone, until a bullet struck him. He died that day. He was about 45 years old. William Henry Harrison, who had commanded the American forces at Tippecanoe, and likely at the Thames, became President of the United States in 1840 on a campaign slogan recalling his victory over Tecumseh, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The most successful election campaign of its era was built on the defeat of one man. Here is what you must understand about what Tecumseh actually accomplished. He did not win, but his project was, in its logic, entirely correct. In the decades following his death, the United States did exactly what he had predicted. They pushed westward, treaty after treaty, war after war, until the indigenous peoples had lost nearly all of their territory. And wherever nations fought separately, without the coordination Tecumseh had called for, they lost faster and more completely than where they managed to unite. The bitter truth of Tecumseh's death is that his vision was realistic. It was perhaps the only strategy that had a genuine chance of working, and it failed not because it was wrong, but because he ran out of time. There is one thing few people know about Tecumseh. He firmly opposed the torture and massacre of prisoners. In several battles and skirmishes during the War of 1812, atrocities were committed on both sides. But in the forces allied with the British under his command, Tecumseh personally stopped the massacre of American prisoners. He demanded that captives be treated with dignity. A British officer who served alongside him later wrote, "Tecumseh was the most brilliant and honorable person I ever met in my entire military career. This is not the image of the wild savage that old textbooks presented. It is the image of a man who had principles, precise ethical principles regarding the conduct of armed conflict. Principles that, in the context of a particularly brutal war, were more scrupulously respected by him than by most of his adversaries. Let the night do its work." There is something specific about the figure of Tecumseh that lingers long after the books are closed. It is the intelligence of a man who understood exactly what was going to happen, who saw, with painful clarity, the logic of what was being built against him and his people, and who built, with the means he had, the most rational, ambitious, and coherent response possible. He did not win, but perhaps he was not wrong. This man who saw what was coming, his death did not stop what he feared. 17 years after the Battle of the Thames, a president signed a law, and for a people who had followed the rules, built a constitution, founded a parliament, and won before the Supreme Court, it all proved to be insufficient. Chapter 8, The Trail of Tears. Tecumseh had seen the blade coming. He had tried to build a shield large enough to hold it at bay. 20 years after his death, another nation tried an entirely different approach. Not weapons, not military coalitions, the law, democracy, the Constitution. The courts of justice. They did everything American society claimed to value. It wasn't enough. In 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution. Not an adaptation of a European document, not something they were told to write. A deliberate Cherokee constitution Approved by a Cherokee Constituent Assembly establishing a three-branch government, executive, legislative, judicial, modeled on the most sophisticated aspects of American democracy. This government sat in New Dakota, in present-day Georgia. It had an elected parliament, the National Council. A bilingual press, the Cherokee Phoenix, founded the following year. A functioning judicial system, a bureaucracy. Since the early 1800s, a portion of the Cherokee Nation had adopted certain aspects of American agricultural life. Permanent farms, cotton, European clothing. Not out of shame for their culture, but out of strategy. They sought to make it impossible to argue that they were savages and therefore unfit to own land and govern themselves. American and European observers who visited Cherokee territory in the 1820s described an organized, prosperous, literate society. The American journalist and lawyer Jeremiah Evarts, who visited Cherokee territory in 1829, wrote that it was difficult to imagine a more civilized society anywhere in the world. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, the law authorizing the federal government to negotiate treaties of exchange with indigenous nations east of the Mississippi, trading their ancestral lands for lands to the west in what is today Oklahoma. The word negotiate deserves scrutiny. In the case of the Cherokee, the treaty that ultimately justified their removal. The Treaty of New Dakota, signed in December 1835, was signed by a minority group of Cherokee without a mandate from the legally constituted Cherokee government, against the explicit will of Principal Chief John Ross and the vast majority of the population. Over 16,000 Cherokee signed a petition against this treaty. The National Council formally rejected it. The American government ratified it anyway. The Cherokee then did something remarkable. They took the case to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1831 and 1832, two major cases, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, raised the question of whether states could impose their laws on the territories of sovereign indigenous nations. On March 3, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered his ruling in Worcester v. Georgia. He sided with the Cherokee. The laws of Georgia, Marshall concluded, did not apply to Cherokee territory. Indigenous nations were distinct, independent nations, with sovereign rights protected by federal treaties. The state of Georgia had violated those rights. The victory was total on a legal level, on the level of American constitutional law. And Andrew Jackson, it is said, though the exact phrasing is debated, responded with something like, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." He ignored the Supreme Court's ruling, and the federal government proceeded with the removal. The autumn of 1838 began coldly in the Appalachians. Federal soldiers, about 7,000 men, received orders to round up the Cherokee from their homes. They had hours, sometimes minutes, to grab what they could carry. Families torn from their houses, their farms, their gardens. Men seeing their fields left unharvested, their animals abandoned, their tools thrown in the dirt. They were gathered in detention camps, stockades in reality, where they waited, sometimes for months, in catastrophic sanitary conditions. Dysentery, measles, pneumonia. The Cherokee who died in the camps never even made the journey, and for those who left, about 16,000 people. The march itself lasted between 3 and 6 months. Hundreds of miles through the winter of Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, snow, cold, shoes that wore out and were not replaced. Insufficient food, not enough blankets. The dead piled up on the side of the road, buried in haste or not buried at all. Quanah, whose name means fragrant in Cherokee, was 9 years old that month. She carried her little sister on her back for 2 weeks because her mother was too weak to walk. One morning, the little sister did not wake up. Quanah kept walking. Between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee, perhaps more, estimates vary, died during the removal or in its immediate aftermath. Out of 16,000 deported, the surviving Cherokee called this path Nunna Dal Isunyi, the trail where they cried. In English, it became the Trail of Tears. There is something in this history that needs to be said directly. The Cherokee had not resisted with weapons. They had played by the rules. They had adopted the Constitution, founded the press, won before the Supreme Court, and it meant nothing. This is not a minor detail. It is the heart of what the Trail of Tears says about the nature of what was happening in 19th century America. It was not a question of the behavior of indigenous nations. It was not a question of civilization or the lack thereof. It was a question of land and who wanted to occupy it. There is a particularly bitter irony in the fact that the very year the Indian Removal Act was signed, in 1830, gold was discovered on Cherokee territory in Georgia. Georgia organized lotteries to redistribute Cherokee lands to white American citizens before. The removal was even completed. John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee, did everything to avoid the removal. He sent petitions, wrote letters, pleaded before Congress. He lost his wife, Quady, on the trail. She had given her blankets to a sick child and died of exposure. He survived. He rebuilt a nation in Oklahoma. He presided over the Cherokee government until his death in 1866. His entire life was a series of losses followed by reconstruction. Loss and reconstruction. Loss and reconstruction. There is a sentence of his that has been preserved. He wrote it in a letter to the American Congress in 1836, before the removal. A people who have loved their country may perhaps be pardoned for wishing to remain in it. The night moves on. You do not have to remember everything. Let those numbers, 16,000, 3 centuries, settle somewhere in your memory without asking yourself what to do with them. Just leave this image. A path in the snow. Footsteps. A child carrying someone. This trail still exists. You can walk it today. There are signs along the historic route in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. Rest stops, interpretive centers. And that path has not disappeared either. That path in the snow, those steps of a deported nation, did not end with the death of those who traced them. 50 years later, their descendants were still walking. Not toward the east this time. Toward the future. Toward something that looked like a promise. They were dancing. 50 years later, on the plains of the Dakotas, a movement born of desperation would meet a fear born of ignorance, and the result would be a morning that no one wanted to look at clearly. Chapter 9. The Ghost Dance in the Morning of Wounded Knee. That path in the snow, those footsteps of a deported nation, did not cease with the death of those who traced them. 50 years later, their descendants were still walking. Not toward the east this time. Toward the future. Toward something that looked like a promise. They were dancing. We must start with a vision. In January 1889, a man named Wovoka, a northern Paiute born around 1856 in Nevada, fell gravely ill during a solar eclipse. While unconscious, he said he traveled to the afterlife. In this vision, he saw a renewed world. The ancestors had returned. The bison, decimated almost to extinction by American hunters in the preceding decades, were back. And the settlers, the soldiers, the reservation agents, all of it had disappeared. Not through violence, simply vanished, swept away by a wind of renewal. And the way to summon this renewal was a dance. A circular dance without instrumental music. Men, women, and children holding hands, stepping in the opposite direction of the sun for hours, sometimes to the point of exhaustion and trance. During the trance, some saw their dead relatives. Some received messages. Some returned with new songs they had heard in the other world. Wovoka also preached peace with the Americans. Do not fight, he said. Violence is not the way. Dance, keep dancing, and the world will renew itself. The ghost dance movement spread like something for which there are no easy words, not like a rumor, not like a fad, like water in parched earth. The Lakota nations of South Dakota received the message in 1889. They were living in conditions of extreme misery, confined to reservations, dependent on federal food rations that were regularly reduced or delayed, deprived of their main sources of food since the bison had been virtually exterminated. Between 1868 and 1889, their territory had been reduced by more than half through successive treaties. In this context, Wovoka's vision had a profound logic. It offered what nothing else could offer, the possibility that things could be different, that what had been lost could return. Thousands of Lakota began to dance. The reservation agents, the military men, the American journalists who watched the movement grew afraid. Profoundly, viscerally afraid. Why? This is where the history becomes strange and revealing. The ghost dance was peaceful. Wovoka himself explicitly preached nonviolence. The observers who actually looked at what was happening, and there were some, reported that it was a spiritual practice, not a military preparation. But some agents and journalists reported the opposite. They described warriors in a trance, wearing ghost shirts, tunics that the dancers believed made them invincible to bullets, ready to march on the forts. It wasn't true, but it was what some wanted to hear. And once fear settled into the offices of generals and Congress, it took on a life of its own. In December 1890, the U.S. Army decided to arrest Sitting Bull, Tatanka Ayotaka, the Hunkpapa Lakota chief, a figure of resistance since the 1870s and a symbolic supporter of the ghost dance movement. On December 15, Indian Agency police, Lakotas themselves employed by the reservation agent, came to arrest Sitting Bull at his cabin. A scuffle broke out. Sitting Bull was killed. With his death, a portion of the terrified Lakota community went on the move. Among them was Chief Spotted Elk, known as Bigfoot, a Miniconjou chief, about 64 years old, sick with pneumonia so severe he could not rise from his wagon. Bigfoot was trying to lead his group, about 350 people, the majority being women, children, and elders, toward General Miles's camp under a white flag. He wanted to surrender, to place himself under the protection of the U.S. Army. He believed a formal surrender was the only way to avoid violence. On December 28, Bigfoot's group was intercepted by the 7th Cavalry Regiment, the very same regiment Custer had commanded when he was defeated at Little Bighorn in 1876, and escorted to Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They were told to camp there for the night. Soldiers established a perimeter. 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire artillery pieces capable of firing 50 rounds a minute, were positioned on the heights overlooking the camp. On the morning of December 29, soldiers entered the camp to confiscate weapons. Here is what we know with certainty. A shot was fired. We do not know for sure who fired it. A soldier? A Lakota resisting the confiscation of his rifle? Perhaps a gun went off accidentally in the confusion. It remains a point of debate in the testimonies and investigations today. What we do know with certainty is what followed. In 20 minutes, between 250 and 300 Lakotas were killed. Most were women, elders, and children. People fleeing were gunned down hundreds of yards from the initial camp. Wounded trying to crawl to safety were killed. Bigfoot himself, too sick to stand, was found dead in the snow. 25 American soldiers were also killed, mostly by the crossfire of their own comrades in the chaos. In the days that followed, a photographer from Chamberlain, South Dakota, arrived on the scene. He photographed the frozen bodies of the Lakota victims, piled into a mass grave dug by men hired for the day by the Army. Those photographs still exist, and a few months later, in April 1891, 20 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment received the Medal of Honor, the highest military distinction of the United States, for their participation in what happened on December 29. 20 medals for Wounded Knee. In 2001, the U.S. Congress refused a formal request to revoke those medals. In 2021, the Pentagon launched a new review to examine the issue. That study is still ongoing. There is a detail in the story of Wounded Knee that is rarely mentioned. Among the soldiers of the 7th Regiment that morning, there were men who remembered Little Bighorn, or who carried the legacy of that memory like a debt to be settled. The Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876 had been a catastrophic defeat for the U.S. Army. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and his 268 men had been killed by Lakota and Cheyenne forces under the command of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. For the U.S. Army, and for the 7th Regiment in particular, it was an undigested humiliation. Some historians argue that Wounded Knee was, for some of the soldiers, a revenge, not a rational military operation. Revenge, against ghosts, against a 14-year-old defeat. If so, the women and children who died in that camp paid a debt they had not incurred. The ghost ants did not survive Wounded Knee. The movement collapsed. Wovoka himself, hearing the news in Nevada, could never again publicly preach his vision with the same intensity. But something survived, the memory. The Lakota communities kept the memory of Wounded Knee with a precision that has not dulled over the generations. In 1973, members of the American Indian Movement, an indigenous political movement founded in 1968, occupied Wounded Knee for 71 days to protest living conditions on reservations and demand the honoring of treaties. That occupation gripped the world's attention. Wounded Knee is not a healed wound. It is a wound whose exact location is still known. The night is deeper now. Your breathing might be slowing down. Let this December morning be there, somewhere in your consciousness, without having to do anything with it, without a conclusion, without a satisfying answer. An old chief in a wagon under a white flag, dying of pneumonia, convinced that surrender was the only way to protect his people. He was wrong about that, but he had tried. He had tried with what he had. Wounded Knee was the last violent uprising, but the war against indigenous peoples did not stop there. It shifted its ground. It moved from the battlefields to the classrooms, and what was done in those classrooms was, in its own way, just as lasting. Chapter 10. Kill the Indian to save the man, that white flag in Bigfoot's wagon, that surrender that did not protect. It was the last gesture of armed resistance. What followed was not peace. It was a war of another kind, more silent, longer, harder to see. It took place in classrooms. In 1879, an American officer named Richard Henry Pratt founded a school in an old military barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He called it the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Its founding principle was expressed in a speech of a frankness that has never since been surpassed in its sheer brutality. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. What he meant by that was precise. Not killing Indians. To kill them would have been to acknowledge their existence. No, erase the Indian from the inside. Strip away the identity, the language, the beliefs, the practices, and leave a body emptied of its culture, ready to be filled with American culture. Carlisle was the first of a series of institutions that would stretch across the United States and Canada for over a century. The boarding school system. The model was as simple. In its horror, government agents, sometimes missionaries, sometimes police, would arrive on the reservations and in the villages. They took the children. not the adults. The youngest children possible, sometimes just 3 or 4 years old. Parents who refused to cooperate could lose their food rations, be arrested, or face other sanctions. The children were taken hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles from their homes, far enough that returning was impossible without help. At the school, the first thing to go was the hair. They cut their hair, long hair, which in almost all North American indigenous cultures carried profound cultural and spiritual significance. They were given European clothes instead of their own. They were given an English or French name, and they were forbidden to speak their language, not just in class, everywhere. In the hallways, in the dormitories, in the schoolyard. Every time a child spoke a word in their native tongue, the punishment could range from a slap to a beating with a belt, to confinement, to the withholding of food. A report written in 1920 by an administrator of a Canadian residential school, a document found in the archives, not as evidence of abuse, but as a routine report, describes how a 9-year-old boy, caught speaking to a classmate in his native language in the schoolyard, received 20 lashes with a strap. The report mentions the name of the administrator. The name of the child is not recorded. You have to understand what it means to grow up far from your parents, in a language you do not understand, with an identity you are told is shameful. Psychologists who have worked with boarding school survivors and with their children and grandchildren have documented something called intergenerational trauma. A trauma that is transmitted biologically and behaviorally. Parents who did not know how to show affection because they had never received any. Parents who no longer knew their language and could not pass it down. Families whose bonds had been severed by institutions and who no longer knew how to retie them. The effects of this system are measurable today in the health statistics of indigenous communities. Rates of depression, addiction, and suicide disproportionately higher than the general population, not as an inevitable fate, but as the lasting trace of deliberate institutional violence. In Canada, the last federally funded residential school closed its doors in 1996. Not 1896, 1996. There are people alive today who were students in these institutions, who carry in their bodies the marks of what was done to them, and who look at their children and grandchildren with the hope, not always fulfilled, that the transmission can be repaired. In July 2022, Pope Francis traveled to Canada. He visited a Cree community in Alberta. He knelt and he spoke the word that the Catholic Church, which had run the vast majority of these schools, had until then refused to say. He asked for forgiveness. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded in 2015 that the residential school system constituted cultural genocide. 150,000 children passed through these institutions between the 1830s and 1996. Between 3,200 and 6,000 died in the schools, buried in unmarked graves without their families ever being informed. In 2021, geophysics researchers using ground-penetrating radar began identifying unmarked graves on the grounds of former residential schools. 215 children beneath an apple orchard in Kamloops, British Columbia. 751 anomalies in the soil at Marieville, Saskatchewan. These children did not remain statistics. Their names, one by one, are beginning to be found, to be read aloud. There is a debate in Canadian and American historiography over the term genocide. On one side, those who argue that the term is precise. The intention was explicitly to destroy cultures and break the intergenerational transmission of identities, to make peoples disappear as peoples, even if the bodies of the individuals survived. The legal definition of genocide in the 1948 UN Convention includes imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The boarding schools explicitly fit this latter definition. On the other side, some historians argue that the intention was assimilation, not extermination, and that the term genocide dilutes its own meaning if applied to policies whose stated goal was to integrate even brutally and forcibly indigenous peoples into the dominant society. This distinction is not purely academic. It has legal, political, and, for surviving communities, deep emotional implications, and it remains open. What is not up for debate is what was done. The nature of the acts is documented. What is debated is the name we give them. Indigenous communities, Lakota, Cherokee, Cree, Ojibwe, Inuit generally have their own answer to this question. Their words, in their languages, for what they endured are older and more precise than international legal categories. Something important must be said. There were teachers in these schools, and not just teachers, but administrators, principals, who tried to make the system less cruel, who turned a blind eye to children speaking their language, who sent letters to families when they could, who refused certain punishments. They existed. Their existence does not change the nature of the system, but their existence says something about the complexity of human history, that there are almost never entirely homogeneous sides in a catastrophe, and that individuals can act against the logic of the institutions in which they are caught. This is not an absolution, it is a precision. There are children today in language immersion programs in British Columbia, in Oklahoma, in Nova Scotia, in the Mohawk communities of upstate New York, who are learning their mother tongue for the first time, not as a second language, as a first language, as the language in which they dream. Among their teachers, there are people who survived the boarding schools, people who knew the rooms where children were beaten for uttering those very same words. What they teach, they paid for with their own flesh. And the children learning do not yet know all this. They just know that the words are beautiful, that their grandmother smiles and they say, "Them, that is perhaps enough for tonight." Those words surviving, those languages growing back in the mouths of children, are proof of something the boarding schools could not extinguish. And in that memory, certain things have been kept that we do not yet fully know how to read. Chapter 11, What the Earth Kept. Those words returning in the mouths of children, those Cherokee syllables, those Ojibwe consonants, those tones and nuances that only a language can carry, are not the only things that survived. Other things waited in the silence, in the earth, in chords, in black soils, things we do not yet entirely know how to read. There are museums around the world that hold strange objects. Bundles of cords, hundreds of fine woolen strings dyed in red, yellow, brown, white, attached to a thicker central cord. These cords are knotted. Simple knots, double knots, spiral knots, knots placed at different distances from one another. Some objects have 20 cords. Some have more than 500. These objects are called quipus. In Quechua, the language of the Incas, the word simply means knot, and they hold, perhaps, the entire history of an empire. The Incas at their peak in the 15th century, the largest empire in the Americas and one of the largest in the world, left no written text in the sense we understand the word. No manuscripts, no glyphs on stelae, no clay tablets. What they left were cords. The quipus were the administrative tool of the empire. Numerical data, population censuses, food stocks and state granaries, tribute figures, army sizes, were encoded in the knots. The type of knot, its position on the cord, the color of the cord, the number of twists. Each variable added a dimension of information for numerical data, and researchers have managed to decode these quipus quite thoroughly. They are objects that function in a decimal system, like our numbering system, with a positional logic that modern mathematicians recognize. But there are about 200 quipus in the world's museums, out of roughly 900 known in total, that do not follow this logic. Their structure is different, more complex, less regular. These might be narrative quipus. Sabine Hyland, a researcher at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, spent years studying 2 quipus found in the colonial town of San Juan de Colada in Peru. These quipus were made from the fibers of several different animal species, llama, alpaca, vizcacha, each having a slightly different texture to the touch. In a study published in 2017, Hyland proposed that these variations in texture, in addition to variations in color and knot structure, might represent phonetic syllables. If this is the case, quipus could encode words, sentences, narratives. It is not yet fully deciphered. It is a hypothesis, a solid hypothesis with serious structural evidence behind it, but not yet a complete reading. Then in 2021, Manuel Medrano, a Peruvian researcher at Harvard, announced that he might have decoded the first narrative quipu, an object found at San Juan de Colada that seemed to encode the names of 6 local villages organized by their geographical position. If this reading is correct, it is the first time a narrative has been deciphered in a quipu. And if narratives can be deciphered in quipus, if the Incas truly encoded histories, genealogies, and treaties in these cords, then there might be hundreds of texts from an entire civilization carefully preserved in the museums of the world that no one yet knows how to read. Imagine the Library of Alexandria, intact, incomprehensible. This is not the only thing the earth has kept. There are the roads of Chaco. In February 2025, a team of researchers from the University of New Mexico published the results of a LiDAR study, a laser technology mounted on a plane capable of seeing beneath vegetation over the Chaco Canyon region in northern New Mexico. They discovered new road segments that no one had seen for 1,000 years. These roads date from the era of the ancestral Puebloans, the people who built Pueblo Bonito and the other great structures of Chaco Canyon, between 900 and 1150 of our era. The roads known since the 1970s, traced on the ground, perfectly straight, some nearly 30 feet wide, were only the visible part of a much more extensive network. The new segments revealed by LiDAR show roads aligned with extraordinary precision to astronomical points, particularly the sunset at the winter solstice. Some roads lead to sites no one even knew existed. And one of the strangest things about these roads, they never take the easy, flat terrain when it exists. They go in a straight line, and when they hit a cliff, they carve stairs right into it. They climb the cliff in a straight line rather than going around it. These roads were not made for horses, nor for wagons. Not even, it seems, primarily for trade. Some researchers believe they were ceremonial roads. Lines of power connecting sacred spaces, invisible from the ground but perfectly readable from the sky. Roads for the gaze of the gods, or for gods who could see from the sky. And then there are the plants, a fact most people don't know. About 60% of the crops grown in the world today were domesticated for the first time in the Americas. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, squash, avocados, cacao, vanilla, pineapples, sweet potatoes. All these plants were domesticated by indigenous peoples, selected, hybridized, improved over generations from wild forms often vastly different from what we know today. Original wild corn, teosinte, was a grass with small, hard seeds and a rigid husk. Transforming those seeds into sweet, nutritious ears of corn took millennia of selection. It is one of the greatest plant breeding projects in human history. And aspirin. A word about aspirin. The active ingredient in aspirin, salicylic acid, is derived from willow bark. The use of willow bark as an analgesic and anti-inflammatory was known and practiced by dozens of indigenous peoples of the Americas long before Felix Hoffmann synthesized acetylsalicylic acid at Bayer in 1897. It is estimated that 25% of modern medicines are directly derived from or inspired by medicinal plants used by indigenous peoples. Quinine against malaria from the cinchona bark. Dozens of antiparasitics, anesthetics, natural antibiotics. What we called traditional medicine was, in many cases, rigorous empirical pharmacology accumulated over millennia of observation and testing. There is a question that haunts researchers working in this field. How much knowledge have we lost? The plants themselves still exist in the forests and gardens. But the knowledge of their properties, their uses, their combinations, their preparations, that knowledge was transmitted orally from generation to generation by healers and herbalists who were often the direct targets of colonization. Because their knowledge competed with that of the missionaries and European doctors, when a healer died without passing on their knowledge, killed by disease, imprisoned, forced to abandon their practice, something disappeared with them that was not written down anywhere. Ethnobotanists today work with elders, who are sometimes the very last repositories of knowledge on dozens of medicinal plants. They work with urgency, not for the glory of discovery, but against the clock. Here is what moves me in all this continent. This world we called new when it was actually old had accumulated, over 15,000 years of human presence, a body of knowledge of extraordinary depth, on plants and their properties, on soils and their fertility, on the stars and the seasons, on governance and conflict resolution, on construction, engineering, architecture. Much of this knowledge disappeared brutally, rapidly, without anyone having the time to write it down, but not all of it. The Quipus waited in their museums, Terra Preta waited in its soils. The roads of Chaco waited beneath the desert scrub, the medicinal plants waited in the forests. And the languages forbidden for so long, punished so often, waited in aging mouths that had not forgotten. The wait has been long and it is not over. But something is still waiting, patiently, with the patience of the black earth that regenerates itself. What waited in the cords, in the soils, in the roads under the earth, was not a ruin, it was a promise. And the peoples who kept that promise in their bodies, their memory, their language, are still here to keep it. Chapter 12, The Resurgence, What Refused to Die. Those cords in the museums, those quipus waiting to be read, look, if you stare at them long enough, like a question. Not a question about the past, a question about right now. Are we, this time, going to really look? In 1900, several renowned American demographers published studies on the indigenous population of the continent. Their conclusions converged. If the trend continued, the indigenous peoples of North America would disappear by the end of the 20th century. Not because of a new violence, but by attrition, a population too small, too impoverished, too scattered to reproduce at a sufficient rate. These demographers were wrong. Not slightly, fundamentally. Today, in the United States, over 9 million people identify as Native American or Alaska Native, alone or in combination in the census. That is the 2020 census figure, the highest ever recorded. In Canada, the population of First Nations Métis and Inuit exceeds 1.5 million and has one of the fastest growth rates in the country. It is not that the numbers were manipulated. It is that something happened that the demographers of 1900 had not anticipated. The indigenous peoples refused to disappear. That is a sentence worth pausing on. It is not a romantic metaphor. It is not a figure of speech. It is a precise description of something concrete in the face of conditions that could have annihilated any human community. Epidemics, removals, land dispossession, boarding schools, laws banning ceremonies, the dismantling of family structures. Millions of people continued to exist, to have children, to pass down what could be saved. Not on an equal playing field, not without immense damage. With traumas that continue to be measured in the health statistics of reservations, in the suicide rates of the young, in the wounds of families that never quite reassembled after the boarding schools. But they are there, still there. There is a program in the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma called the Cherokee Immersion Program. It started in the mid-2000s, and today it welcomes children as young as 3. The principal? The entire school day is in Cherokee. Teachers only speak English to the children if it is absolutely necessary for safety. Math, science, geography, everything is in Cherokee. Among the teachers in this program, some are what they call fluent speakers. The last to have learned Cherokee as a first language in homes where their grandparents still spoke it. One of these teachers, a woman who prefers not to have her name published, grew up in a family where the adults had been to boarding schools. Her mother had not passed the language down to her, because her mother had learned to hide it. It was only in her older age that this woman rediscovered her language and decided to pass it on. She now teaches 5-year-olds, children who make Cherokee grammar mistakes, who laugh at their own errors, who go home and teach their parents the words they learned that day. These children do not yet know why this language almost disappeared. They will know. But for now, the language is in their mouths. And in their mouths, it is alive. In matters of governance, something is happening too. The Haudenosaunee nations, the 6 nations, direct descendants of those who built the Great Law of Peace, have their own government in Onondaga, in upstate New York, not a puppet government delegated by the American state. Their own government, which sits in the central longhouse, which makes decisions by consensus according to the principles of the Peacemaker and Hiawatha. This government issues its own passports, Haudenosaunee passports, recognized by more than 24 countries around the world, including some European nations. When members of the 6 nations travel as diplomatic delegates, they travel with these passports. In 2010, the Haudenosaunee lacrosse team, the nation that invented the sport, was denied entry to the World Championships because British authorities would not recognize their passports. The Haudenosaunee refused to travel with American or Canadian passports. They stayed home. This is not nostalgia. This is politics. There is something happening in science as well. The traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, long ignored or marginalized by Western science as superstition, is beginning to be recognized as a body of rigorous observation accumulated over millennia, irreplaceable by any other method. Indigenous rangers who observe the animal migrations in the Canadian Arctic know about changes in the behavior of caribou and whales that satellites do not yet detect. Indigenous fishermen of the Pacific describe variations in ocean currents that climate models struggle to map. Healers know properties of medicinal plants that pharmacologists are only just beginning to explore. Partnerships between indigenous communities and scientific institutions, Canadian universities, Australian research labs, United Nations programs are multiplying, not always without tension, not always on equal terms, but they exist. The knowledge is returning to the circuits where it can be of use, and there is politics. In 2007, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a text that affirms the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination, to the preservation of their cultures and languages, to the control of their territories and resources. 144 countries adopted it. 4 rejected it: the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the 4 countries with the largest indigenous populations dispossessed by Anglophone colonization. These 4 countries eventually adopted it later, between 2009 and 2010. The adoption of a declaration is not the same thing as a transformation of living conditions. The reservations where children grow up without reliable drinking water, without qualified teachers, and without access to health care, they still exist. The missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, their rates are disproportionately high, and the investigations are disproportionately slow. That still exists. The Declaration did not make injustice disappear, but it named something that can now be named, and naming is always the beginning. I want to tell you one last thing before this night closes. The Terra Preta of the Amazon, that black soil manufactured 1,000 years ago, still fertile today, does not regenerate by a miracle. It regenerates because it was designed for that. Because the people who created it understood something about living systems that modern science is only just beginning to formalize. That fertility is not a resource you exploit until exhaustion. It is a process you maintain, you nourish, you pass on. The indigenous cultures we have explored tonight, from the Haudenosaunee to the Cherokee, from the builders of Cahokia to the gardeners of the Amazon, had in their considerable differences something in common: a conception of time that extended beyond an individual life, a responsibility toward generations not yet born, the conviction that what we do today belongs to someone we will never meet. The Haudenosaunee principle of the seventh generation, the Terra Preta designed to feed unknown great-grandchildren, the roads of Chaco aligned with an astronomical precision that no living person would have the time to see fulfilled. This way of thinking about time as something that does not belong entirely to you, as something shared with the dead and the unborn, is not foreign to the universal human experience. It is inside us, somewhere. It is in the idea of planting a tree whose fruit you will never see. The indigenous peoples of the Americas did not invent it, but they perhaps guarded it better than most. The night is deep now. Your breathing has changed since the beginning of this story. It is slower, quieter, and your body knows what your mind is still learning to accept. That rest is a form of trust. That letting something else take charge of the world for a few hours, a voice, the night itself, is a way of saying that the world can go on without you for now. There was, in the indigenous societies of North America, a practice that anthropologists have documented in many cultures, the vigil. Not just the wake for the dead, the ordinary vigil. In the evening, around a fire, someone told stories. The elders, the storytellers, the keepers of memory. And the children fell asleep to the stories, lulled by a voice saying, "Here is where you come from. Here is what you carry. Here are the people who were here before you, and who you resemble more than you know." This practice is not unique to the Americas. It is at the heart of all human cultures. The evening gatherings, the bedtime tales, the stories grandparents tell in New York, in Chicago, in Montreal, in Dakar, in the warmth of a kitchen or by a fire, when the children have heavy eyes but do not yet want to sleep. It is something very old, what we are doing here tonight, older than books, older than the letters Sequoyah invented for his people, older than the great law of peace, older than Cahokia, older than the first grain of corn selected in a Mexican field, a voice in the dark, someone telling a story, and someone listening, who slowly, without thinking about it, approaches the edge of sleep. If this night has brought you something, an image, an idea, the name of a person you did not know, I am glad. It is enough. You can subscribe if you want to return the next time a long night awaits you. You can leave a comment to say where you are listening from. The United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, or anywhere in the world where this voice travels in the night. Or you can simply stay there, in the warmth of what you carry, and let the night do its own work. There is a Cherokee child, somewhere in Oklahoma, sleeping right now. Tomorrow morning they will go to school, and in that school a 60-year-old woman will begin the day in Cherokee. She will say the words of welcome in the language of Sequoyah, in the language of John Ross, in the language they tried to erase for 100 years in rooms where rulers fell on the palms of children. And that child will answer in Cherokee, without thinking about it, because it is their language. Somewhere in the black earth of the Amazon, seeds are growing tonight in a soil that an anonymous hand enriched 800 years ago. Somewhere in a museum in Lima, in Berlin, in New York, a quipu waits in the darkness of a display case, its knots tied tight around something we have not yet learned to read. And in the archives of universities and monasteries and national libraries around the world, documents that no one has yet consulted hold, perhaps, the names of people we thought forgotten. Nothing is entirely lost. Nothing ever has been, not entirely. That is perhaps the most important thing in everything we have said tonight. Not a promise, not a happy ending. Just this quiet observation, resting on centuries of proof, that things hold, that the earth keeps, that memory always finds, somewhere, a mouth to return. Good night.